Good morning, people of God. We are so blessed to be able to gather together once again in the blessed name of Jesus, who is the Christ. Good morning to our Canaan family. Good morning. Sunday school lesson. Before we begin, let us, of course, look to our God who has allowed us to gather together this morning. God, our Father, we are so privileged. So, Lord, we pray for health and strength. Continue on. So, today's is titled David Dances Before the Ark. David dances before the ark, taken from 2 Samuel, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 5, and then 14 through 19. That's 2 Samuel, 6th chapter, verses 1 through 5, and then verses 14 through 19. Now, there are two very significant aspects to this lesson for this morning. One is the beginnings of what would come to be a unified Israel under one king, and also the use of the Ark of the Covenant in a very different way, and an established kingdom being at Jerusalem. Um, we begin by reciting our verses for this morning, but even I'm going to begin at the end of the 5th chapter and read that verse, even though technically it is not part of the lesson, because certainly the first verse of chapter 6 would make a little more sense if I did so. And so 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter, the 25th verse. And David did so as the Lord commanded him, and smote the Philistines from Geba until thou come to Gazer. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 1. Again, David gathered together all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baalah of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, that dwelleth between the cherubims. And they set the ark of God upon a new cart, and brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in Gibeah. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drave the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab which was at Gibeah, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments made of fir wood, even on harps and on psalteries and on timbrels and on cornets and on cymbals. Verse 4 through 19. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And as soon as David had made an end of offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well to the women as men, to every one a cake of bread, and a good piece of flesh, and a flagon of wine. So all the people departed, every one to his house. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are two significant aspects to our lesson today, and certainly we have difficulty understanding the lesson if in fact we don't bring to light the importance of these two things that I mentioned earlier, one being the Ark of the Covenant itself, and then of course David's situation becoming a king under a united Israel. The Ark of the Covenant was something that God had made that would symbolize his throne, as it were, on earth. And of course, God's presence over and on the ark. Now, within the Ark of the Covenant, which was made out of wood and overlaid with gold, which happened to be not as large as someone might think, for it was 2 feet by 4 feet. But inside the Ark of the Covenant were the tablets of stone upon which God had written the 10 Commandments that he handed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and of course he had come down to tell the people what God would demand of them. So you had the 2 tablets of stone within the Ark of the Covenant. And then something else that was important, when God was looking to establish a priesthood, the deciding factor was the fact that the rod that Aaron, Moses' older brother, used actually budded. It began to sprout new life, such that God then signified that Aaron would be the first priest, and all those descendants of his. Of course, both Moses and Aaron were from the tribe of Levi, and so the priesthood was established. So that rod that Aaron had that budded was also inside the Ark of the Covenant. And then, in addition to those two objects, was a golden jar of manna. Now, if you're not familiar with manna, manna was food, a wafer like substance that God gave the nation of Israel as they were traveling in the wilderness as a food substance, certainly because the people needed to eat. But of course, there's greater significance in that God certainly provides for those that belong to Him. So the Ark of the Covenant, as far as today's lesson is concerned, was once the um, ark had been constructed and those elements put inside. It enjoyed a very special place in the worship that would take place on the Sabbath. It was placed in the tabernacle such that it was away from the people, and it was behind a curtain, which was the beginning of what would ultimately be the Holy of Holies that would come to be eventually when an actual temple was constructed later on in Jerusalem. But as I mentioned, it signifies God's throne here on earth, and of course, God's very presence. So wherever the people of Israel traveled on their way to the promised land, certainly the Ark of the Covenant had to be carried along. And the mandate was that it was only the priests that would carry the Ark of the Covenant. And as part of the construction of the Ark, there were rings, 4 rings, 2 on either side of the Ark, through which wooden poles would be inserted, and the priests would carry the Ark using those wooden poles because it was forbidden that anyone touch the Ark of the Covenant because of the significance that it represented, the presence of God. If you remember, during the time Moses was up on Mount Sinai meeting with God, the people were even forbidden from getting too close to the mountain upon which God had come to commune with Moses. But in the first book of Samuel, around the 5th chapter, the Philistines, who were one of the enemies of the nation of Israel, um, saw that whenever there was a battle and the Ark of the Covenant went before the armies of Israel, that they always won the battle. Because God's presence was there, they were able to do that which without God's help they wouldn't be able to do. And so the Philistines saw this as somewhat of a good luck charm. And they felt as though if they had it, then they would be able to be the victors as opposed to the nation of Israel. And so they captured it. And then, of course, once they captured it, they realized that it was not what they thought it would be. And of course, they sought to return it because of the trouble that ensued while it was in their hands. And even so far as the sixth chapter of the book of First Samuel, there was a situation where, because of the awesomeness of God's holy presence, God had struck down 70 individuals at Beth Shemesh for just looking into the ark of the Lord. So it was not something that should be trifled with. As I mentioned, it certainly had significance of itself, but certainly because it represented God's throne on earth, and certainly His holiness, whereby people could not approach it, and it was only the priestly line that were asked to be able to come near it and to transport it with the guidelines from place to place. And so our lesson begins with David gathering together all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baal of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, that dwelleth between the cherubims. Um, Certainly, once they were in the promised land, even before they actually had a temple that was ultimately constructed, the Ark of the Covenant still held its place of significance um, in the tabernacle that David had erected. Eventually, once they got to where it was ultimately going to be, and we're going to touch on that just in a little bit. Verse 3, and they set the ark of God upon a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in Gibeah, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drave the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was at Gibeah, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. Verse 5, and David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments made of fir wood, even on harps and on psalteries and on timbrels and on cornets and on cymbals. So once the ark was recaptured captured from the Philistines, there needed to be a place where the ark would be housed to keep it away from the Philistines. And certainly David, who had been anointed king even before the removal ultimately of King Saul, they had to keep that ark, and David chose that ark would be kept in the house of Benadab, who of course was of the priestly line. Certainly, before King Saul was ultimately no longer king, he had sought the death even of David because of his anger, of course, with God, that he was to be able to, but he was to be removed. Why, you ask, was Saul removed? Was because he did that which was forbidden, and that he sacrificed to the Lord instead of waiting for the priests to do. Um, and because of that, and because, of course, that the people had selected Saul because of his physical stature and being good looking, and he was from the house of Benjamin, that God sought to remove Saul from being king. And even as David was a young person, God sent for a new king to be sought after from the house of Jesse. And even though that all of the older brothers had been looked at, God ultimately chose David to be the next king before even that would take place. And so once Saul found out about that, he sought to kill David. Well, ultimately, in battle, Saul fell upon his own sword, and thereby removed himself from being king even before the Lord would do so. And so David's desire from that point on was to eventually gather all of the people together, because certainly the successors, the sons of Saul, also sought to become king, and of course David was looking to not have any more separation between them. And so as the cart is being prepared to move, what happened was it was drawn by a team of oxen, and the cart itself hit a bump. And as the cart was getting ready to fall over, it was grabbed instead of using the pole to right itself, and such that God took the very life of the one who actually touched it, because of the holiness, the presence of God. It was forbidden that anybody would touch it. But certainly, we and our way of thinking would feel as though, why, for such a what seems like a common mistake that somebody might make, would God takes one's life? We certainly have to understand that God's ways are not our ways, and certainly if anyone as unholy as we are can just approach the holy presence of God whenever we either feel like it or circumstances dictate it, then certainly it would less the significance in our minds of who God actually is. The book of Proverbs speaks to that. The 14th proverb, the 12th verse, tells us that there is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is death. We cannot do what we think is right when it comes to the dealings with God. We have to go according to what God says and not question Him. We are further told in the third Proverbs, verses 5 through 7, that we are to trust in the Lord with all our might and lean not on our own understanding. But we have to acknowledge God in all that we do, and God, of course, will direct our paths. And so, as they are moving toward where they ultimately are going to place the Ark of the Covenant, David had it in his mind that he was going to conquer these Jebusite city and change it to uh, being called the city of David or Jerusalem. And so he, in addition to moving toward the city of Jerusalem, he begins to add wives and concubines and excuse me, fathers, many more children, and he once again defeats the Philistines, and of course he becomes even greater and greater. And so once he gets to the city of David, called Jerusalem, there is reason for great joy in that David, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to unify the people and not allow the sons of Saul, who certainly would look to be king, from becoming kings with any kind of significance. And certainly there is room for great celebration as David gets to Jerusalem. And verse 14 begins by telling us that, and David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. Now, if you're not familiar with this vestment that I mentioned that David had put on, a linen ephod, that was part of the priestly garb. And so you would say, well, certainly isn't that what sealed Saul's fate, in that he sacrificed and did the work of the priest, not being of the priestly line, being from the tribe of Benjamin as opposed to Levi. So why would David put himself almost in a similar situation? Well, certainly what should immediately come to mind is that Saul was not the king that God himself had chosen, that he allowed the people to make that choice. And certainly there was all kinds of warnings from Samuel that what would take place in the event that the people asked for a king, when in fact God wanted to be the one to lead them without any kind of intermediary in terms of a monarchy. So it says, David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. So certainly there was great um, great joy in that they were going to celebrate that the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord was then going to be central to their worship, and they welcomed being able to have God's presence among them. And so we are told that David laid aside his royal robes and appeared in the distinctive dress of a priest. And as a king and representative of a kingdom of priests, the king took on a priestly character, exercising on this particular occasion a priestly function in directing the sacrifices, even if he did not offer them himself, and in blessing the people. So David didn't do what Saul had done, being mindful of what had taken place, but knowing that there is a big distinction between being a priest and being a king. Of course, it's a foreshadowing later on when, of course, in the person of Jesus the Christ, who is, of course, king and priest. Um, but David certainly did not want to do that which he knew he wasn't supposed to do. So there was all kinds of shouting and praising God. And whilst the translation tells us that it's the sound of the trumpet, we know from our understanding of Jewish history and life that it was in all likelihood the horn of a sheep, a shofar that they were blowing in celebration um, um, of what had taken place, and that they had brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. And verse 16 reads, "And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart." Now, if you're not familiar who Michal is, other than the fact it just mentions that she was Saul's daughter, David actually had asked Saul for the right to have his daughter's hand in marriage. But as you heard me recount earlier, is that David, in addition to having Michal as his wife, spelled a little differently, and it was in that it's Michal, but pronounced Michal, that he had taken upon himself other wives and other concubines and fathered children with them. And so certainly she saw herself as less significant to David, in addition to the fact that she was not able to bear children. Certainly that doesn't give David any reason based on that alone to take other wives and concubines. But being a king, they felt as though that they had a right to do whatever they wanted to do. But certainly you can understand why she despised David in her heart. Um, in addition to it, she thought that David was somewhat degrading himself by this public exhibition. Um, and So, in addition to her feeling anger toward David because of her relegation to less than the chief wife. Um, Certainly, she didn't like the fact that David um, despised, that David was bringing, as she thought, shame upon himself. Um, she was also, I guess, in her mind, in her despising of David, saying, is that, you're not really a king. Look at the way you're acting, and that my father, who was a king, wouldn't have done any such kind of thing. So she certainly was acting in an aloof kind of way and didn't participate at all in the celebration. Um, but she continued to despise him on account of his presumed, in her mind, degradation of himself and lack of royal dignity, so to speak. In verse 17, and they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And as soon as David had made an end of offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Okay, so there are three things that we need to pay attention to. There are three worship gestures, if you will. One, the sacrifice, the blessing, and of course the distribution of food that would take place. And at the time that David blessed the people, and he offered a burnt offering and a peace offering, he entered the tent of meeting, and upon exiting it, blessed the people again. Although the significant details of David's action here is less elaborate than that of Aaron, its significance is neither diminished nor lost. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord, and the offerings being ended, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, which was introduced at the beginning of the account in the second verse of chapter 6 that we had read earlier. And verse 19, as we're coming to close, and he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well to the women as men, to everyone a cake of bread and a good piece of flesh and a flagon of wine. So all the people departed, everyone to his house. So at the end of the celebration of the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant and bringing it to its significant central part house in the tabernacle that David had erected for it, which even though the tabernacle is somewhat a temporary home, it had in essence, a permanent home in the city of Jerusalem, until which time a temple ultimately would be built by David's son Samuel. But at the end of the celebration, David makes it aware of his caring for the people, that they would each get a cake of bread and some good piece of meat, probably that came from some of the peace offerings. Remember, there were animal sacrifices that took place. And in addition to that, David gave them wine to with which they would continue celebrating over in their own homes as they left. But both the meat and the raisin cakes would, of course, been very special treats to help the people celebrate what is now a very historic occasion, and in addition to which, show the very generosity of the king. And so that ends today's lesson. We look forward to seeing you next week. As I always say, if God should spare our lives, where the lesson title would be Glorifying God, right on the heel of our today's lesson. Glorifying God, but this time taken from the New Testament Gospel according to Mark, from the 10th chapter, verses 46 through 52. So next week, we'll have a lesson entitled Glorifying God, taken from the New Testament Gospel of Mark, the 10th chapter, verses 46 to 52. And so until we meet again, with God is our prayer that He would watch over you and keep you and show you how much He loves you. And if you have not yet yielded yourself and accepted God's free gift of salvation, we certainly pray that God would move upon your heart and that you would do so in this upcoming week. So we look forward to seeing you. God bless you. God bless you. God bless you.